Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here at your center. It's very important for those of us who work in the fields of Central and Eastern European history to know about the existence of centers of this kind in various parts of the world. Here I can see there's a joint emphasis on the northern tier of Central Europe, the Baltic states, which of course makes perfect sense. And today, as opposed to other presentations that we have been having that are in fact devoted very specifically to this book, last night we had a 1 hour public kind of interview with your journalist Peter Johnson on this about the book. Considering the fact that this is a university setting, I will talk less about the book per se, but more about some conceptual issues that we faced when dealing not only with this specific book, but with, for all intents and purposes, studying Jewry on the territory of Ukraine. And so, in effect, two elements that I would like to draw attention to today are matters of terminology and matters of regional diversity. The very topic, if you will, of the overall project that we have been engaged in, the encounter between Jews and Ukrainians, from the very beginning raised some conceptual issues. First of all, can one legitimately speak of Ukrainians and Jews, or for that matter any group, as if in fact they are distinct self-perceived corporate entities, whether that be in the past or in the present? In other words, do individuals that others define as Ukrainians or as Jews actually feel themselves to be part of a group? And do they somehow act in their daily lives in a manner that reflects a so-called group or national or ethnic characteristics? And what do we mean by Jews in Ukraine, or Ukrainian Jews? And who are Ukrainians? Are Ukrainian persons with definable Ukrainian ethno-linguistic characteristics? Or are they all persons, regardless of ethno-linguistic origin, who are citizens of a state today called Ukraine? Now, here, and also in effect in this book, we're using the following definitions, which, in a sense, govern our understanding behind what we call the Ukrainian-Jewish encounter, namely that Ukrainian, the term Ukrainian, refers to a group whose members identify as belonging to the Ukrainian nationality. That being the case, I prefer to use in all of my writings, including in the big history of Ukraine that I published several years ago, and this volume, the term ethnic Ukrainian. Why always using the adjective ethnic? Well, that is to, if one is speaking about ethnic Ukrainians, that is, or a group of people who are defined by a specific ethno-cultural characteristic, to distinguish them from the broader category of citizens of Ukraine, which is also technically Ukrainian, but that's all the country's population, regardless of ethno-linguistic or national background. So you'll hear me saying ethnic Ukrainian quite often when I'm speaking about specifically a group defined by their ethno-national characteristics and not their citizenship. The term Jews in Ukraine, or Ukrainian Jews, at first glance would seem to be relatively easy to define, namely persons of Jewish religion or Jewish heritage who were born or who live in Ukraine. But what about Jews of the historic past who lived at a time when Ukraine as a state did not exist? Not only here, but in general for our work, we inevitably, as many scholars do, we have adapted a rather anachronistic approach. That is, persons of Jewish background are designated as Ukrainian Jews or Jews from Ukraine if they have resided at some point in history on the territory of present-day Ukraine, from earliest times to the present, and that's regardless whether a state called Ukraine had existed when the Jews in question lived there. Now, let's be upfront here, that understanding does not necessarily coincide with how each of the groups in question has perceived itself. So, in a sense, there's a kind of perceptual disconnect. On the one hand, ethnic Ukrainians considered their homeland to have always been Ukraine, a territory that only in the course of the 20th century became clearly defined and eventually an independent state. On the other hand, the Jews in question are part of a worldwide diaspora, one branch of which, called the Ashkenazim, had until recently inhabited large parts of Central and Eastern Europe, including areas which, from their perspective, have only recently, quote-unquote, become Ukraine. And this first map on this sequence of three, map 13, which I think is the first map, or is it the first map? No, look at map 13 in your sequence. The first map must be number 3. Map 13 does show the concentration of Jewish population at the outset of the 20th century on the territory, with the boundary of contemporary Ukraine, so you can see the relationship between contemporary Ukraine and where Jews lived in large numbers, with the darker green obviously being the highest concentrations. But in those cases where some more specific territorial origin is called for, there's general and often vague terms that one encounters to depict the places where Ukrainian Jews live include the Pale of Settlement, which is basically all of the green on this map. It's only part of the Pale of Settlement, but that part in Ukraine. Or Russia, in more recent times the Soviet Union. This is how, the point here, this is how Jews would define themselves in relationship to those terms: Russia, Soviet Union, earlier Pale of Settlement. Or when we speak of Hasidic adherents of Judaism, of which there is a very high number, a high percentage among Ukraine's Jews, they're not interested in many cases with any temporal geographic place at all. Their identity has been and still is in many ways some rabbinic dynasty with which they are associated. Could be the Belz dynasty, Bratslav, Chernobyl, Savran, Zlotsev, Munkach, Ruzhins, Sadgora. These are only some of the most important Hasidic dynasties on the territory of present Ukraine. And then there are also Jews who may identify with a specific region, such as Galicia, Galiciana, or Bukovina, Carpathian Rus, Carpathian Jews, or Crimea, Krimchaks. Point is that for Jews, the concept of a Ukraine is very rarely mentioned as an identifier. to describe their origins or their origins of their ancestors. Russian Jew, Polish Jew, Soviet Jew, Galiciana, Krimchak, a Belz or a Munkacha dynastic follower. Those are the terms that are usually used, not likely the descriptor Ukrainian Jew. Various regional and country names do nonetheless reflect real differences within what we are defining here as Ukrainian Jewry. In many ways, the Jewish cultural mindset derives from geopolitical structures that date from the late 18th century to the outbreak of World War I, the so-called historic 19th century. That period began with the partitions of Poland, or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, between 1772 and 1795, hence the late 18th century. And after 1795, when Poland and Lithuania ceased to exist, those lands, which until that time had belonged to the former Commonwealth, were now annexed to the Russian Empire, and that was what became known as the Pale of Settlement, part of which you see on this map. These are former Polish-Lithuanian lands. This Pale, which for all intents and purposes in modern-day, present-day terms are the countries of Lithuania, Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine, it was there that the highest number of Ashkenazi Jews anywhere in the world resided. And within that, some of the highest concentrations, as you can see by the dark colors on map 13, are in the territory of western Ukraine. What are we talking about here? 1897, there were 4 million Jews living in the Pale, within the Russian Empire. And that, aside from that, there are another estimated 2 million who emigrated from the Pale to North America, especially to the Northeast United States, particularly between 1897 and 1917. And those people in North America do, in fact, describe themselves at that time, and still their descendants to this day, as Jews from Russia or Russian Jews. Now, as you can see, the Pale referred to Russian imperial provinces on Ukrainian territory. Those included Volhynia, Podolia, Kiev, Chernihiv, Poltava, Kherson, Katerinoslav, a little bit of Taurida, where the Jews were permitted to reside. So, with few exceptions, the Russian imperial government, why were they there? Because the Russian imperial government, for all intents and purposes, followed Muscovite policy of banning Jews from living within Muscovy in Russia, and only with some exceptions in the 19th century could they live beyond the Pale. It's that phrase in English, which actually comes from the experience of Ireland. The English had their serious place in Ireland, and those rest lived beyond the pale of English settlement. But even within the Pale, there were various restrictions on where Jews could reside. And beginning in the 1880s, they were for a while even banned from moving as first-time residents to rural villages. It was also within the Pale, and specifically in those Tsarist provinces located in Ukraine, where the anti-Jewish pogroms of 1881 and 1882 took place. But despite these restrictions and periodic violence, the Kishinev pogrom in 1903 is probably the most infamous at this time, though it's actually not in present-day Ukraine. It was actually in present-day Moldova. Despite all of this, there were places within the Pale where Jewish communities continued to flourish and actually even increase in numerical size. This was particularly the case in the Crimean Peninsula, where beginning in the 1880s, Ashkenazim from other parts of Ukraine and other parts of the Pale, even in Belarus, began to settle in large numbers along the Turkic-speaking Krimchak Jews and the Karaites who had been there for several centuries. Now, in stark contrast to the Jews living in Russia's Pale of settlement, were those residents in present-day Ukraine who found themselves, after the 1770s, within the Habsburg-ruled Austro-Hungarian Empire. The differences between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, in particular vis-a-vis peoples other than the dominant ones or the titular ones. I'm trying to avoid the term national minority because even you may have an institute call it. That's a terrible term. They're just peoples like any others, but the non-dominant peoples of a state. And here, if you look at map 15, is those areas of the Habsburg Empire about which I am referring, both in the Austrian half of that empire, which included Galicia and Bukovina, and in the Hungarian part of that empire, which included Transcarpathia. The Jews here were able to take advantage of all of the liberal policies and reforms that Teresa and her son Joseph II implemented in the 1780s and 1770s already, in 1780s, among them legal equality for all citizens regardless of religion. Emancipated Jews were now able to take advantage of full freedom of movement and settlement anywhere in the empire, allowed many of them, among other things, to improve their economic status, in which, in fact, Jews did very well within pre-World War I, Habsburg Austria-Hungary. And then in the 1880s, when the danger of pogroms rocked the neighboring southern half of the Russian Empire, which was bordered with the Habsburg Empire, in particular in Ukraine and Moldova, Jews from Russian-controlled Pale of settlement sought refuge, often permanent refuge, by crossing the border and settling, at least initially, in those Austrian-ruled Habsburg provinces of Galicia and Bukovina. We also know then, when the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist, during the last years of World War I, the Jews of present-day Ukraine now found themselves in 4 new states: Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Those in the former Russian Empire, now in Bolshevik-ruled Soviet Ukrainian Republic. Soviet policies actually had both a positive and a negative impact on their lives. On the one hand, religious Jews and their institutions were suppressed. Petty merchants and retail shop owners were put out of business. On the other hand, Soviet law lifted all legal restrictions against Jews as a group, with the result that hundreds of thousands were able to make successful careers in Soviet institutions, whether those be in government institutions, in universities, scholarly research, or in the industrial management sector. So much for the Soviet Union. Jews from Ukraine and former Austro-Hungarian lands, as I said, now after World War I in Poland, Galicia was annexed to Poland, Romania, Bukovina was annexed to Romania, Transcarpathia joined Czechoslovakia. During those interwar years of the 20th century, the pre-World War I Habsburg tolerance was replaced by restrictions, most in particular in higher educational institutions against the Jews, particularly in Polish-ruled Galicia and in Romanian-ruled Bukovina. The only exception here was democratic Czechoslovakia, where Jews were able to achieve economic, social, and educational advancement. That was even not available in pre-World War I Habsburg Hungary. Now, what kind of conclusions might we draw, and what kind of recommendations may be made on the basis of what I said, what I've just said, in terms of terminology and regionalism? Well, the first conclusion has to do with the very formulation, Ukrainian Jewry. If we are to use that concept as an analytical tool, then at the same time we must accept the fact of Ukraine's regional diversity and the significant impact of that regional diversity on Ukraine's Jewish inhabitants. Now, clearly, the frequently negative experience of Jews in Russia's Pale of Settlement during the 19th century is not the same, far from it, of the flourishing world of Galician and Bukovinian Jewish life under Habsburg rule, as we just mentioned in the neighboring Austro-Hungarian Empire. Whereas pogroms were characteristic occurrences at certain times in the 19th and 20th centuries in many parts of Ukraine, for that matter, in other parts of Eastern and Central Europe in general, one territory in present-day Ukraine, Transcarpathia, historic Subcarpathian Rus, never experienced pogroms or even any other forms of violence, which some Jewish historians classify as excesses. A somewhat related conclusion and recommendation is the need to move away, to move on beyond the simplistic notion that the historic past of East European Jewry is little more than a story of unmitigated tragedy. Many descendants of Jews in North America who have no idea what the historical record was, just think of Central and Eastern Europe, maybe in particular Ukraine, as a black hole. The Jewish American scholar Stephen Zipperstein best summed up this problem in an essay on Holocaust historiography, and I'll quote one paragraph from that. In the absence of historical work, in the wake of fierce, definitive immigrant memories about what life back there was like, and also in the aftermath of the Shoah, pervasive premonitions of horrors regarding Eastern Europe were conflated and granted a grim prescience. What does he mean? As he says here, Nazi horrors and Tsarist pogroms meshed in the often sparse, repetitive narratives that Jews tended to tell about this vast and very complex region. And as he continues, the distance between life in Vilna, which was the center of this incredibly intellectual, productive world epitomized by the interwar YIVO institution. So the distance between life in Vilna and death in Treblinka tended to narrow in these accounts, as if these differences were just simply detail, not substance. Now, to the degree that Ukraine is part of this Eastern European world, the manner in which its very name is treated becomes actually symptomatic of what Zipperstein is saying, and in and of itself a matter of concern. As we know, stereotypes are very hard to overcome, especially when they are embedded in cultural discourse that goes back centuries. For instance, the medieval designation in Jewish sources for Slavic lands in Central and Eastern Europe, and that includes all of Ukraine, was Canaan, or Canaan. The implication here is that it was, quote, the land of slaves. And as Max Weinrich has reminded us, quote, the history of Yiddish, it was the great Yiddishist, the history of Yiddish and the history of the Ashkenaz are identical, but having said that, not in all periods or in all places did European Jews speak Yiddish. One can be particularly struck by a monograph by another Jewish scholar, Benjamin Harshaw, called The Meaning of Yiddish, where he lists the various other languages used by Europe's Jews, from Italian to Russian to English, and a whole host of others in between. It's interesting that this list that Harshaw enumerates one otherwise very influential language, which was not only spoken by large numbers of Ashkenazim, but also was one that had an important impact on the later development of Yiddish, is not mentioned. This unmentionable language, not on this list, was Ukrainian. Since traditionally most Jews refer to it not by its name, as they did Polish, or Dutch, or Czech, but rather simply as Goyish. So there was no Ukrainian language, it was just Goyish. Now, even within the Jewish world itself, the unmentionable Ukrainian lands took on sometimes especially negative characteristics. I have in mind here the Galiciana. This was a term used to describe not only the Jews of the historic province of Austrian Galicia, but also, in terms of Yiddish dialects, all Jews living farther east in parts of the right bank. So when you classify Jewish dialects, and there's a map of Jewish dialects in this book, Jews and Ukrainians, Galicia even refers to Yiddish dialects beyond historic Galicia. Point here, however, is that in contrast to the superior German Jews, and even though they're Easterners, quote unquote, the more sophisticated Litvaks, Jews from Greater Lithuania, the term Galiciana, and here I'm quoting the YIVO Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe, the term Galiciana is a cultural identifier bearing, for the most part, negative connotations. And what are those negative connotations? So what's a Galiciana, which is a Jew from Galicia? A troublemaker, a shrewd operator, a money grubber, a religious fanatic, a spineless compromiser, a speaker of popular vulgar Yiddish, and someone ashamed of his or her origins, but who liked to pose as an Austrian. This is the view of other Ashkenazim, and particularly the Litvaks, toward the Galiciana. Now, nomenclature, as you probably all know, has enormous symbolic as well as instrumental value. The subject of the inquiry here in our work should be Ukrainian Jews or the Jews of Ukraine. Also place names, whether towns or historic regions. This is also a problem. Should reflect usage in the country where they are located today, and not in some language or in some form that no one can find on a contemporary map. Of course, we should be aware of the reality of numerous name variants for virtually every city, town, and village in Central and Eastern Europe. A colleague of mine who teaches Central and Eastern Europe, and he tells his students from the very beginning, if you do not know when you walk into this class minimally 3 names, if not 5 names for every town, then you don't belong in this class. This is kind of an absolute minimum. Of course, we have all of these examples. But in Ukraine or in Czech Republic or in Poland or in Russia we should use the present-day names. So, for instance, like Lviv, perhaps Yiddish alternatives of Lemberek or Lvov in parentheses, but not to call it Polish Lvov or Russian Lvov. Why? It's in Ukraine today. With regard to historic regions, the more accurate Kievan Rus should be used, not Kievan Russia, which still you will find in some English language texts. Point here is being more sensitive to terminology and consistent use would certainly be of great help in our common efforts to eliminate unnecessary and at times harmful misperceptions. And it's misperceptions and stereotypes which were somewhat on our mind when I and my co-author, Professor Johann Petrovsky-Stan, conceived this book, which some of you have just looked at, and wrote it. The book begins with, in the very first page, in the short introduction, with 10 stereotypical or misperceptions and how ethnic Ukrainians view some event and how traditional stereotypical attitudes Jews view that same event. And the rest of the text is an attempt to, if not deal specifically with these stereotypes, tell the story of two peoples, ethnic Ukrainians and Jews, living on the territory of Ukraine, but not purely from a historical perspective, but rather taking or adopting the principle that if you want to understand a given society, you cannot really understand a given society, and certainly peoples who live in that society, by simply telling the political history. One needs to know how they lived, what they created, what they didn't create, what they spoke, what they believed, both in terms of pre-religious and religious heritages. And so that is the effort that we have made here, realizing that this is a quintessential North American style 1-hour seminar in which lunch is combined and 1 hour is coming up. I will stop here and entertain any comments or queries that you may have. Thank you. Actually, I think this is wonderful. I think I recorded at least 10 different disciplines around this table, at least. Some of which I am also quite interested in, such as historical geography, because I'm a cartographer, or sociolinguistics, because I work in that field as well. So please, thank you very much. If there's any subsequent queries that you may have.
So the floor is open for the questions. Does anybody like to start? Yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
Magocsi, I really appreciated this very much. It opened up my mind to thinking. My mother's family always called themselves Russian Jews, coming from somewhere near Kiev that they never wanted to mention.
The unmentionable.
In 3 different languages.
Right.
The book is about coexistence, and when you went through your terminology in the very beginning, you didn't go into what would coexistence actually, in a theoretical way, mean. This is important for we who are working with coexistence of Roma as well. It's just survival side by side with another culture. Is that coexistence, or is coexistence actually some kind of relationship in your mind? What would that be?
Mm-hmm. We thought a lot about what we were going to use in the subtitle, And we chose that precisely for its vagueness, that it literally can be either or one or the other of what you've just pointed out, just simply physically being in the same physical space, as well as having mutual influences on each other. And in actual fact, if we understand coexistence from that perspective, in retrospect, I would say, very often we look at things we do in retrospect and say, would have done something different. In this particular case, no, we would have done the same thing, namely, and why? Because the actual story, when one reads this book, one will see that in some areas, because we move across the board from traditional culture, religion, language, literature, theater, architecture, painting, etc. In some of these areas, there is actually mutual influence of one culture upon another. You can see it in the field of, for instance, of language, in the field of traditional culture, things like cuisine, sometimes dress. But in others, they just simply, these two people are living side by side. They're existing in the same physical space, but there's a limited amount of mutual influence. So the answer to your question is that the term was chosen for its lack of precision or vagueness because it is both, and you put your finger on it without reading the book.
I read the title.
Yeah, well.
But wouldn't it be wise, if we are in an academic milieu, to try and give it a definition somehow so that it can be seen operationally? I mean, multiculturalism did get a definition of meeting in the marketplace, though nowhere else. I'm thinking that there are various degrees of that. Perhaps there are various degrees of coexistence.
Yeah, I cannot remember whether in fact we do that. I tend to think that unlike this presentation here, which is also not in that book, we may not in fact define the term coexistence, though we make reference, certainly in the last chapter of the book, that we make reference to the interaction or lack of interaction, etc. But whether it is actually defined, I tend to think not. But might be. And now I will, when I go back and look at it, maybe it is already in there. I can't remember.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Professor Magocsi, for your talk and for your amazing work. And I have not so much questions as maybe corrections. I was able only to have a brief look at the book you have kindly circulated around. And I have seen that this portrait of Hetman Ivan Mazepa is credited to an unknown painter. But in fact, I would say that this is a painting by Serhiy Vasilkivsky. So a Ukrainian painter.
Yes, and who's discussed otherwise in the book.
Yeah. So I think it would be basically for future editions. It would be a nice correction. Another thing. Well,
there's a revision going on right now. Okay. Literally, the second edition is. What page is that on? And what's the illustration number? While we're doing some editorial work right here, we might as well do it right.
It's number 18.
Illustration 18 or page 18?
Illustration number 18, page
Excellent.
28. yeah.
Thank you.
Happy to be of use. The other one is perhaps less factual, but I think it is still important because you have a very interesting discussion here about the use of ethnic names such as Hebrei and Žid in the Ukrainian context. And you say that while Žid is offensive in Eastern Ukraine, it is acceptable in Western Ukraine, or at least that has been the historical tradition. I must say that it's probably more complicated than that, because myself, coming from central Ukraine, like my father's family is from Cherkasy region near Kharkiv. My mother's family is from the borderlands between Chernihiv and Poltava region. For the older members of the family, who basically, of course, came from the countryside, it was perfectly normal to use Žid as ethnonym. So from my understanding, from this family history, it was perfectly acceptable in Ukrainian countryside to use it, and also to use it to sort of like address people of this nationality, and no offense was meant and taken. So I think the line here probably should be drawn between the countryside use and the city use. And whereas in the countryside, all over Ukraine, the use of the ethnonym Žid was pretty normal, not offensive, right, in Ukrainian language. In the cities, it imitated the model of the sort of dominant urban argot or lingua franca, which was Polish in the West, and of course it had Žid as the main and only, and of course totally non-offensive ethnonym. In the Ukraine under the Russian domination, or the imperial domination, first of all, if we look back at the 19th century when probably these things kind of settled down. Of course, the use was, the dominant language in the cities was Russian, so the offensiveness of the word Žid in Russian sort of translated in the city environment also to the Ukrainian language. So I think it is slightly more complicated than just West versus East, but it should be probably seen as urban versus countryside, and eventually organic, authentic Ukrainian versus the hybridization of Ukrainian with the dominant language of the state.
Thank you. I am not all that certain that it is today.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Today, sure. A division between the countryside and the urban areas.
Yeah.
This book, first of all, is written for it's a popular book for a general audience. And we needed to discuss certain problematic areas. I can tell you, because I spend a lot of time in Ukraine, on Ukrainian lands, in the last 20 years. And since I speak several West Slavic languages, Czech, Slovak, and I know Polish, the most natural thing in the world is to say Žid, Židovsky, as you correctly pointed out. This is the only word. Yeah. And we know that historically, not simply because of the influence of Polish upon Ukrainian in Western Ukrainian lands such as Galicia, for that matter, Bukovina, where there wasn't influence of Polish. Žid is the normal word, like as it is in Czech and in Slovak and in for spoken Ukrainian, and for literary Ukrainian in this Galician form when it was codified in the 19th century. You see this term all over the place? You're absolutely correct. It has no negative connotations whatsoever. Today, as a result of several decades of Soviet rule, it is like almost verboten. If you say Žid almost anywhere on the territory of Ukraine, unless you're pretending to speak some dialectal form, or you know, your accent will give you away that you come from. I mean, this is like and for someone in our profession, oh, this is verboten. Simply not. I mean, it has been so implemented and driven into the mindset of Ukraine today, adopting the Russian perception of these words, that I don't see this anymore as a division between the countryside and the urban areas. It is just, and it's a false perception, obviously, because there's nothing wrong with it, and it becomes worse when we have people in the diaspora who have a smattering of knowledge of Slavic languages. And so we will have several people who, you know, Americans or Canadians who, Jewish background, non-Jewish background, will study Russian, they'll know some Russian, hardly know Ukrainian or any other Slavic language, and they hear this, and you know, they're insulted on behalf of the subject that they study or who they pretend to be. So it's in that context that we tried to explain it. I actually wrote that portion of the book. Tried to explain it in that manner, that because it's a stereotypical perception that, you know, Žid means kike. Well, it means kike in Russian, but it doesn't mean kike in. It didn't have that tradition in many parts of central and eastern Ukraine, absolutely, and it certainly never had it in western Ukraine to this very day.
A question out of my ignorance, is related to the choice of language of the Jewish population. And one thing, in a situation where you have a state language, a local language, and a minority language, the minority tend to take the state language instead of the local language. So what was the more emancipated Jews, the more liberal Jews in Ukraine and also in Habsburg Galicia, did they take Russian and German as the language, irrespective of the local language surrounding them?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. You've posed the question and answered it because you don't really need to know the details. They apply to most European states historically. And it's just as simple as that Jews in general spoke Yiddish, and many of them could also communicate in Ruthenian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, etc., because they interacted as part of this coexistence, certainly in the economic field. But if they were going to enter into a kind of status of social mobility and move on, they would adopt the state language, which in the case of the Russian Empire would be Russian, and in the case of the Austro-Hungarian Empire would be German or Hungarian. So the Jews of Transcarpathia, all Hungarian speak, either Yiddish or Hungarian speakers. The Jews of Galicia and Bukovina, either Yiddish or German. But there was also a period in Galicia in particular where Jews were Polonophiles. And so Polish would be the other language, even though it was not the kind of state language of Habsburg Galicia. It practically, by the end of the 19th century, had, first of all, it had historic prestige and then practical prestige within the province of Galicia. But yes, absolutely, it was certainly not Ukrainian, ever. As something that they would know it, in some cases even speak it, but.
Okay, any more questions? I see that many people have to leave because we have told that it will be till 1 o'clock, and probably they that they have to do that.
Sure.
So thank you very much for this great presentation, for your
pleasure.
lecture today, and thank you very much both all for coming.